Well, welcome to the first session of a new Bible study that I am leading on behalf of beloved San Diego. I'm Dale Suggs, the pastor and of beloved San Diego. And this Bible study is called, Does the Bible Really Say That? Questioning Narratives That Shape Us. And our process will include me making some presentation time about things that giving background for discussion. And then we're going to have some conversation around foundation stories of the Bible. Those stories that we all think we know. But the truth is, we often don't quite know what they say. I sometimes am very surprised. Oh, really? Oh, because it's been a long time since I've read some of them because I assume I know what they mean. I assume I know what they say, and I certainly assume that I know what they mean. So we're going to be looking at what do they really say? And we're going to question how they function as a narrative. That is, as stories that kind of shape our understanding of how the world works and who we are in that world, particularly in our relationship with God and one another. I created a PowerPoint primarily so that I could keep my thoughts straight, because this, in many ways, is a Bible study that's 40 years in the making. I got all kinds of stuff just kind of swimming around up here, and I've never, in a very organized way, tried to work through it. And that's what my goal is here, that together, through conversation and sharing, we can work through those foundation stories, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. So we're going to toggle back and forth month to month. So in November, we're going to be in the Hebrew Bible, looking at some foundation stories. And then in December, we will shift over to the Gospels, the New Testament, and look at some foundation stories, particularly the birth narratives around the narratives around Jesus' birth, which we all think we know, but my guess is there are things in there that we have forgotten or not realized that it was in this story and not in that story. And I'm looking forward to exploring that with you. This is going to be fun. So let me share my screen and get into slideshow from the beginning. What does the Bible really say that? And questioning the narratives that shape us. So I'm going to begin with some principles of Bible stories and some guiding compass points for reading and listening to and telling Bible stories. Now, I should say that all these are mine. These are things that I've developed over time. I'm going to own them in that these are the ones I use. I don't think any of these will end up being original to me. But there are things I picked up along the way, and I want to share with you because these work for me. So 4 principles of biblical interpretation, trying to make sense of the text within the Bible. Now, the first principle is the Bible is many books from many sources, not one book from one source. And say that again. It's many books from many sources, not one book from one source. One of the cultural ideas that floats around within the United States is that, this is one continuous narrative. And it kind of reads like history from front to finish. And that's not how it was put together. That's not how it functions now. It really is an encyclopedia of stories that tell us who God is, who we are in relationship with God, and who we are in relationship with one another. And so when I was kind of working on my opening pictures for our time together, I started with this stack of books. It could represent years and years and years, centuries and centuries of scholarship around the Bible. But for me, it just represents the Bible itself. When I see a Bible, this is how it mentally looks to me. It is a gathering of books. It is a gathering of stories. It's a gathering of histories. It's a gathering of parables. It's a gathering of poetry and songs and wisdom literature and prophecy and law, all gathered together, all these books into one Encyclopedia Britannica, but in this case, Encyclopedia Biblica, that becomes a resource from which we understand who God is, who we are before God, and who we are in relationship with each other. So, the Bible is many books from many sources. The Bible is an encyclopedia of stories. Third thing, biblical narratives in flesh community rather than establish dogma. Now we're going to go forward with this over the next couple of for our conversation here tonight, but there's a couple of pieces of that I think that's important. First, the idea of narratives, that these are the stories, I'm talking about stories. Infleshing means that these stories give the structure and relationship that is the community of faith. The community of faith is formed, made flesh by these Bible narratives. That's different than a perspective that the Bible narratives help us establish dogma, which are lists of rules and regulations and beliefs. I don't think that's the purpose of the Bible. The purpose is to create community, not to establish dogma, beliefs, and rules. Which brings us to that last one. Biblical authority, usually just said biblical authority, is revealed by the community it authors. I'm going to have to play with this one a little bit. That's kind of a tough one to hang on to. So let's try it again. The biblical authority is revealed by the community it authors. In my own mind, I'm saying the word authority is the bringing together of two words, author and community. That's how we ended up with authority. So for me, biblical authority is not a quality of the text itself. It's not a quality of the words on the page. If I were to say, which will be a weird thing for me to say, that the Bible is authoritative for my life, I'm not saying that these words tell me the plan of how I should act and be. Through the last really 150 years, 170 years, biblical authority has been under siege. At least that has been the fear of the more conservative evangelical wings of the church. As science began to expand, as new versions of old biblical texts were found that differed with one another, as people began to realize that the Bible is many books from many sources, not just one book from one source, as all that came into being, there was a fear within the church that the authority of the Bible would be challenged. In fact, people were asking questions. Is the Bible really true? Did it really happen that way? Is God real? All these were questions that really hadn't been asked, but now were being brought forward. And so there became doctrines that would defend the authority of the Bible. The primary doctrine is the doctrine of inerrancy. Imagine you've heard that before. The Bible is inerrant. The caricature of inerrancy is that every word, sentence, comma, semicolon is directly from God and therefore without error. It's really not what inerrancy is about, but it is the caricature we work with. And it was first proposed by some Princeton theologians in the mid-1800s, and didn't really become something that was promoted widely until 1978. Wrap your head around this. This thing we struggle with friends and family, and we see these kind of culture wars going on around the inerrancy of the Bible. This particular doctrine, as we have received it, was penned in 1978. It's a new idea, and it's a defense of the authority of Scripture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on inerrancy. If you were to look at kind of the history of how biblical authority has been cared for, the early fathers of the church talked about biblical authority because it was inspired by the Spirit of God. And then there was a sense that it was trustworthy. And that has been translated into the word infallible in our current context. And then came inerrancy as a final defense of biblical authority. I am not interested in understanding biblical authority as a quality of the text. So while we can talk about inerrancy, I'm happy to do that. And we can talk about infallible, we can talk about inspired. I think those are all very interesting things to talk about. What makes the Bible powerful for me, real for me, shapes my life is not the quality of the word, is not a quality of the words, but the quality of the community that it authors. I was talking with someone at the first gathering this morning for this Bible study, and she was talking about how her son doesn't believe in the Bible, doesn't believe in God, was raised in all of that, but felt excluded from it because he was a gay man, and now has come to believe that it's all just made up. But the problem there is not that the words of the Bible are faulty. The problem is when he looks at the church, he doesn't see Jesus. See where I'm going here? We want, there's so many people want to define biblical authority, to even define the authority of the faith around the something about the words themselves. They're without fault. They are inherently trustworthy. They are inspired by the Spirit of God, which is something that I really do believe. But in our world, that which people are looking for is a community that reflects the teachings of Jesus. And if the community doesn't reflect that, then these words, this history, this faith is not creating what it says it's supposed to, and therefore it cannot be trusted. Trust in the faith is about who the community is that has been authored by this text. Trust is not in the text itself. So I don't talk about the Bible as inspired very often. I do believe it's inspired. I love that word. It has to do with breathing. I believe that God breathes life into the Bible and continues to breathe life into it. I like the word inspiring better. Inspired means you're talking about the words in the book. Inspiring is about how they impact the community that reads it. And I firmly believe that the words in this book, some of them reaching back 4,000, maybe 6,000 years, depends on who you're talking to, these words continue to inspire people to faith. And when they do, they author community that can be trusted. Okay, I'm going to pause there and stop the share here and have some conversation. That's my beginning point for our dialogue together. And I just, questions, thoughts, concerns, what the heck are you talking about? Have you ever heard anything like this before? Am I totally crazy? All of those are welcome questions. Well, y'all are not very talkative at the moment, but that's okay.
I mean, I heard the biblical authority, and then like a community ministry, we ask a question, or the community candidates, and then when I was in seminary, I was asked to write down what is a Bible authority means to you, and it is totally, I mean, it's very fresh perspectives, and thanks for your clarification. Then I have to say the Bible authorities, or I have to copy from the textbook. I without really knowing what I'm saying. But your explanation is much, very much appreciated. I can relate it, as I can say. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I can say, yeah, David said, that's it. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Young Suk. Young Suk and I sat together on the Committee on Ministry for this region of the Disciples of Christ, and we would interview people seeking ordination. And one of those questions is, what is the nature of biblical authority? I'm not sure somebody who gave the answer that I just gave would be ordained. I'm really not sure. Looking for something closer to these are the normative teachings for what it means to be Christian, and they supersede any other writings or teachings in understanding who God is and who we are. Now, in truth, I don't have a problem with that, and I believe that. It's just it ends up being about the words on the page. And I am utterly convinced that if the faith is to survive into the next century, it's got to quit being about the words on the page and start being about the life of the community. That's my conviction. So I would be thrilled if somebody, Committee on Ministry, they gave the answer. I'd be like, oh my God, somebody gets it. And they would be grilled by other people in the room because it's not the answer we're looking for. It's not the answer that's expected. It's not the answer that has been taught. So I'm kind of on the edge when I talk about biblical authority, but I really do believe that these words inspire people to faith. And when they do, they author, they create, they inflesh community. But the authority of the faith will not be the words on the page. It'll be the community that is created. The proof will be when people look at the church, do they see Jesus anywhere? Do they encounter the beloved community anywhere? Doesn't have to be everywhere. It won't have to be perfect, for heaven's sake, that's impossible. But does the compassion of Christ, does it leak out? Is it, can you find the compassion of Christ there? And all too often, people either can't or believe they can't. And therefore, the faith must be made up because it doesn't really transform lives the way you think it does, the way you say it does. That's a struggle. It's a real struggle. Well, I want to move from any other thoughts, questions?
Just a comment. Having spent some time looking at some of the inventions and the scientific incredible speed with which science advanced between the times you're talking about 1850 to 1870 and then on, I can see where science would challenge, be very challenging. Was there another influence? I mean, that would be the overwhelming influence that would threaten the conservative Christian community. But
Well,
was
at the time, it wasn't just the conservative Christian community, it was
whole
the
thing.
center of the Christian community. Princeton was not it wasn't a liberal institution, it was old school, but it wasn't, what we would call conservative evangelical either. It was the center kind of the movement. And it was that rapid development that you're talking about. 1850 to 1870, things just exploded. And the thought that maybe science could save us became a real thought. And so faith began to be questioned as to whether it has validity or not. And
Well,
so the fallback position was, these are the perfect, inerrant words of God. How dare you question them?
well, and I wonder, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were really good friends. They saw each other often, as did some others. And there was so much competition to get your invention patented between 1850 and 1900. And, Edison had more patents than virtually anybody. But I can see where these scientific minds would probably drift together quite a bit, because they feel like now they're sort of out. It'd be interesting to see what their faith was like. That's what I'm getting at. And I don't know. I mean, it'd just be interesting to see.
It would be very interesting. Not something I've ever looked into.
I haven't either. I just never thought of it, but I probably will now.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And we should recognize that I don't remember the date of Nag Hammadi. I think I've said that right. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, these ancient manuscripts of biblical texts that didn't match what we have. And some of them don't even match each other. The shock waves that pushed into the church, because we had science, and then in the late 1800s, moving into the early 1900s, we had textual criticism, which was beginning to ferret out what's poetry and what's prophecy and what's law and what's history, and which histories fit together better, and these histories contradict each other. Did they come from different sources? All of that was beginning to happen at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Yeah.
You can see the chaos that creates if the authority of your faith is based on the words on the page. They had reason to be fearful. It was natural to be fearful. And it seemed logical as I read history that by 1978, there had become such a large enough coalition of people working against this movement that they could come together and make a statement that they agreed on. Imagine a coalition of church leaders and theologians got together and made a statement they agreed on. That in and of itself must have been seen as, a miracle for sainthood, because it never happens, but it happened then. The hassle with inerrancy is that they wrote a bunch of caveats into it in 1978, which have been furthered over time. There are tons of articles and books out there that are trying to argue that inerrancy was a concept of the early church carried forward. Inspiration, that it was inspired by the divinely inspired. Yeah, that was carried forward. I'm all with that. But inerrancy as it's understood. The caveats are amazing in the definition of inerrancy. Here's the doctrine. Inerrancy means that when all facts are known, the Bible in the original autographs, when properly interpreted, will prove itself to be without error in all matters that it covers. These include areas of theology, history, science, and all other disciplines of knowledge. They will be in perfect accord with the truth. The Bible, therefore, is totally trustworthy in everything that it records or teaches. It's pretty straightforward. Here's an expansion of it. The Bible will be understood as inerrant when all the facts are known. We don't know all the facts yet. Science is still uncovering facts. And until all the facts are uncovered, we can't say the Bible is inerrant. The Bible is inerrant only in the original writings. Dead Sea Scrolls pretty much give us lots of original writings to choose from. The Bible is inerrant only when it is properly interpreted. Now, who's defining that one? The Bible is without error and completely true only in areas that it speaks to. I firmly believe that the Bible only speaks to certain things. And we're constantly trying to get the Bible to speak to issues and concerns in our century and in our world and in our culture that the Bible isn't interested in, has no relevance to, and well, relevance is not the right word. It just doesn't speak to it directly. You have to infer a lot. And which is interpreting, which means it has to be interpreted properly, and somebody has to interpret it properly from the original writings, having brought all the facts together. It's a doctrine that can't be disproven because by definition, it can't exist in real time. This Bible they're talking about, this scripture they're talking about, cannot exist in real time. So all of that said, I had fun saying it. I had fun researching it. I don't think it matters. From my perspective, they can argue about the quality of the text till the end of time. All that matters is the community that it forms, the community that it shapes, the community that carries its message of compassion and grace, the community that looks like Jesus. So it was fun looking it all up. It really was. I like scholarship. I like digging through all that stuff. But in the end, it's not really that helpful. I just don't think it's helpful. Let's take another step forward. Young Suk, you had something you're trying to say?
Do we see those community in Hebrew Bible as well? What I mean, I just catch wonders when you say community, then beloved, and
yeah, all of those stories shape the community we are.
Yeah, when you say that, automatically the New Testament, I can relate it immediately, but the Hebrew Bible, I kind of lost here. So I wonder.
Well, see, you know, here is one of the things that I'm working with. Jesus was a very good Jew. His worldview, his perspective of faith, his teachings about God are consistent with the core biblical narrative of the Hebrew Bible.
I see. In that way, okay.
The stories of creation make a difference to who the Jewish people are and to who we are. Story of Noah makes a difference in terms of how we read it and how we tell it to the Jewish community and to the Christian community, and actually to the Muslim community as well. It carries forward. These foundation stories are not overturned by the New Testament. They are part of what, I'm going to lose his name. Could have been Boltmann. My theology professors, if they ever see or hear any of this, are going to be upset. There was a German theologian who coined the term, I love it, Heilgeschichte. Don't you love that word? Heilgeschichte. It means salvation history. He draws upon the idea that the Bible tells the story of God's word at work in the world through time.
Yeah.
And what God was doing in the beginning is as important as what God is doing now. It's part of the flow of salvation history. I don't remember all the nuances of that, but it did impress upon me that the New Testament is dependent upon the Hebrew Bible. It cannot exist independent of it. And the contemporary church cannot exist without the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. So the stories, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, shape the Christian community. These stories tell us who God is, who we are, how we relate to one another, how the world works. That's what these stories do. And we can't say, oh, we're just a New Testament church. The disciples tried that. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ tried that. We're just a New Testament church. You can't, it's not possible, because the New Testament is utterly dependent upon the Hebrew Bible. Are you with me? Okay, darn good question.
Yeah.
It's a question that gets asked a lot. Rick Lowry, who is an Old Testament professor, is at CTS and then at Lexington. I'm not exactly sure if he's even still teaching now. I took a Bible study from him at a regional assembly on the book of Isaiah. And he paused in the middle of it and said, you know, the problem with Isaiah is that the vision is death and destruction, and the vision is utter renewal, all at the same time. And the death and destruction pictures are horrible images of who God is. And the restoration and renewal often don't give a good picture of God either. You see, and these things contradict each other. And he said, it's difficult. People ask me, how do you reconcile those? And his answer was, I don't. But I have to choose what texts I will emphasize, what stories I will tell more than others, what visions of God's future I will uplift or let surface above all the rest of it. And he said, my deciding factor is, does it look like Jesus? You just claim the fact, I'm a Christian. I cannot read the Old Testament without the lens of Jesus. I wish I could. I would be a better professor if I could, but it's not possible. I will always read through the lens of Jesus. And that's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that it colors my perception. The good news is it helps me find God amidst contradictory stories. I firmly believe that the Hebrew Bible stands on its own and has formed a community, which are the Jewish people, and they live in covenant with God. They don't need the New Testament. They really don't. They have a relationship with God. But the Christian people cannot stand on their own with just the New Testament. We are dependent on the Hebrew Bible as well. Okay, let me shift forward a little bit. Figure out where I was. Oh, it's here. There we go. Well, I put out these 4 principles of biblical interpretation. I also want to kind of put out what I'm calling compass points for guiding our reading and telling Bible stories. I didn't want to call them principles. I didn't want to call them assumptions. I didn't want to call them, I wanted them to be something that guides us, not defines us. And so I went with compass points as an image of helping us navigate rather than defining. We'll see if this works. The first compass point for me is that biblical stories tell us about presence, not power. There are stories of power, yes, but the primary purpose of a biblical story is to tell us how to live in the presence of God. It's not to tell us how powerful God is and how powerless we are, or how powerful we are over other things. It's not about power. It's about presence. Biblical stories help us sit in the presence of the sacred. Sit with God. Second compass point is that Bible stories tell us about relationships. They do not create, they're not instruments of control. That's probably the best way to say it. They create relationship, cultivate, nurture relationship. They are not instruments of control. Not only do we get to sit in God's presence, they tell us how to be related to God, how to continue that relationship, and how to be related to the community of faith, and how to be related to the world beyond the community of faith. But relationship, not control. Third compass point is Bible stories help us follow God, not follow the rules. Remember, back in the last one, I was about authoring community, not defining dogma. If I believe that, which I do, then Bible stories are not about, the point of a Bible story isn't to give you a new rule to follow. The point of a Bible story is to give you a God to follow, a Jesus to follow, Abraham to follow, a Moses to follow. There's a lot of following going on in the Bible. Fourth compass point is that God, these Bible stories, through Bible stories, God is inviting us, not instructing us. And what I mean to say by that is, well, it'll come up as we go on, but it's the, God invites us to follow, to be in relationship, and to sit in God's presence. See, it goes both ways around the compass points. It's presence, which brings relationship. So we can follow God, and God invites us to follow and to be in relationship and to sit in God's presence. I believe Bible stories read and told well will help us do these things. Sit in God's presence, live in a relationship with God and each other, follow God's lead, and hear the invitation to be God's beloved children. Now, this is countercultural. This is counterintuitive. It is counter-questioning. And what I mean by that is when we read a Bible text, we usually ask the wrong question of it. That's what I'm suggesting. And when we ask the wrong question of it, we're led down all kinds of interesting paths that become religious warfare and cultural warfare, because when we read a text, what's the first question we want to ask? Just naturally. Laura, you said it. Unmute yourself and say it.
What does it mean?
It's a natural question. You read it, and often it's a little obtuse, and you're kind of trying to make sense of it. And the obvious question is, what does it mean? I'm suggesting that the better question is, what's the invitation? How does this story invite me to be in God's presence, to be in relationship with God, to follow God's lead? When we ask, what does it mean? We usually are asking, what is the moral of the story? Which means, what's the rule we're supposed to follow? Which ends up being the list of rules we have to follow in order to get into heaven. That's kind of how it works. And I'm suggesting that there is an invitation in every Bible story, and that this invitation serves to nurture sacred community. When the only question we ask of the scripture is, what does it mean? More often than not, the conversation becomes about personal agendas or even corporate agendas. I think the conversation becomes about power and exercising control, asserting power, gaining power, maintaining power, expanding power, controlling the people over whom you have power. So when the Bible is just supposed to be instructing us so we can follow the rules, what we end up doing is cherry picking out of Scripture the stories and the texts that fit our agenda. So if it's instructing us and just helping us follow the rules, it really is a measure of control that maintains power. Those are the compass points I think we need to walk away from, because they don't lead to Jesus. They just don't. An example of how this works is Lectio Divina. When we read a scripture in Lectio Divina, there's usually a word or phrase that stands out for us. That's the whole point. And we discover that out of a group of 12 people, we're drawn to 5, 6, 7, 8 different words and phrases in the text. Lectio Divina says this word or phrase that has been highlighted is an invitation to you. It is inspiring you to consider what these words might mean for you in your relationships and your relationship with God. If there's only one moral to the story that we're supposed to learn, all of those 5, 6, 7, 8 invitations are lost. Now, I'll say flat out, I am overstating this big time. And I like looking for instructive stuff, and rules are helpful sometimes. And some people do need to be controlled. But the measure of abuse that has been laid upon the church, upon the world, because we have asked the question, what does it mean? Instead of what is the invitation? If we hear the invitations and follow God into relationships, sitting in God's presence, I know that the beloved community will come into being. The beloved community will never be defined by a list of rules or beliefs. It'll be defined by its relationship with God and with all of God's children. I'm speaking to a pretty receptive audience. In a great number of churches in our country, a great number of disciple churches in our country, I just lost my job. But I've been at this for a very long time, and I just am utterly convinced we're looking at this upside down. And the wild thing is, all of Jesus' teachings turned Scripture upside down. So why would we expect it to function like we expect it. I want to always be asking, and Shelley helps me with this. She does this all the time with me. What is the invitation? What is the invitation to sit in God's presence? What is the invitation to be related to the community of faith? What is the invitation to be related to the community beyond the community of faith? What is the invitation to follow and to invite others to follow too? It's a much better question than what does it mean? So when we're looking at Bible stories in this Bible study, we will struggle with meaning and what it means and what the words mean and what the culture was that it came out of. But all of that is just to set the framework that allows us, sets the foundation that we can stand on in order to ask, what is the invitation? Laying out that framework of meaning and context and language and history and all of that leads us to the question, what is the invitation? So you can expect that with every story, I'm going to ask that question. And you should also expect that the answers to those questions will be answers for you, not for everyone in the group. Your invitation will be different than mine. The wild thing is, if we share our invitations, we let each other know how God is inviting us to follow and be in relationship and sit in God's presence. That's community. That's the beloved community. Strengthened, empowered to go into the world and actually look like Jesus. Thoughts, questions, wonderings?
Oh, as a hospice chaplain for past 6 years, so I was with so many dying people, most of them the Christian, and I was quite wonders, and couldn't answer it. Either they ordained the pastor or the deacons, retired deacons and deaconess, and or elders, and I somehow keep asking me, what is Christian faith? What does it mean to be a Christian? What is it? Because it so many things on the dying so many figures or the fears and anxiety and the way they react to the death, dying, or whatever happens to them. either through the stroke or heart attacks or some other ways, and this other way, the disabilities, the way they shows is that's not what I'm kind of figuring. If we really we are Christian, is a Christian, it should be different. That's what I keep thinking, but I just couldn't see people facing dying in that way. But you give me, I mean, almost this is wonderful. I can tell why if they will keep asking, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? Through all their life. And then be trained that way, and to follow the rules and regulations and norms and living life that way. It can be one way. I mean, there might be some benefits, but
there are.
Yeah, and then living by invitation, through the invitation, I must be, that makes difference that I can tell. So I cannot, because of my I cannot kind of say what I want to say at this moment. I have to sit and ponder, translate my Korean to English.
That's okay. Sit, contemplate, and wonder.
Yeah, I will.
I'm going to really blow your mind for a minute, okay? Because it may help you give a different interpretation of the people who've been living by rules their entire life and thought that was Christianity. One of the things that the Jewish faith does that we have lost is that they receive the laws as an invitation to be in God's presence.
Yeah.
They learn and sing those laws in joy because they are an invitation to be in God's presence.
I learned from my Jewish neuropsychologist when I was trembled and fearful and afraid, and then he always says, he reminds me, yeah, really? Do you really interpret or do you see that way? And then she says, I see this way. And then I kind of aha moment from listening her, she, oh yeah. And it frees me. It kind of makes me drop my burden. Yeah. Somehow she interprets differently. That was so beautiful. So, oh my gosh, I'm the ordained minister, and she says that I don't seldom go to temples or but she lives with it. She practices it. You said exactly. I see it. So yeah. Okay.
For devout Jews, learning and living the law is not a burden. It is filled with joy because it's their invitation to be in relationship with God. And they receive these rules and live them in thanksgiving for the relationship God has invited them into. We don't see it that way at all. I could live with a church of rules if we saw them that way. Really could. But it is so countercultural. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where to go with that. I do want to say that I've been working with people over the last couple of months at University Christian Church who have been approaching death. And one in particular just wanted to debate stuff about faith. And I chose not to debate. Instead, I taught him ways to sit in God's presence. I think at the best, Christianity, what it means is to be invited to sit in God's presence, to be invited to live in loving relationship with God and others. It's to in flesh that loving relationship for the community and for the greater community beyond it. And the best way I know to experience that, at least the best way I know right now, is to teach people how to sit in God's presence, to receive the invitation just to be with God. It is remarkable how anxiety fades, how debate becomes not all that interesting, or at least not life and death. And whether or not you kept all the rules is not even worth talking about, because you're sitting in God's presence. I might even go far enough to say, I haven't thought about this. Maybe death itself is an invitation to sit in God's presence.
That's what I'm thinking, because
I haven't thought through that one, but I'm wondering. So I just want to be real clear, and also should have said from the beginning, scholars disagree. These are my thoughts. These are my reflections. These are my understandings. They are drawn from all kinds of different places and experiences I've had over the last 40 years. I don't know where all the pieces came from anymore. My memory isn't that good. I can't even think of who said Heil Geschichte, for God's sake. You think you would remember that. But so scholars disagree. People are going to utterly disagree with me. My hope is to present something that's helpful, that is an invitation to sit in God's presence and build a relationship with each other, and to embody the beloved community. That's my hope. I am not the end all in biblical interpretation, and I could be flat wrong on a whole lot of this stuff. But I know that question, what is the invitation? That one I'm pretty sure of. That's our 75 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. We will begin next week talking about the purpose of narrative. And then we'll look at Genesis 2, verses 4b. Isn't that crazy? 4b means that there's an obvious break in verse 4 that biblical authors didn't recognize. So if you the story of creation in Genesis 1 ends halfway through verse 4 in chapter 2.
So don't you dare read 4a. Just don't even.
Oh yeah, don't even bother to read 4a. Oh no, forget that. No, we're going to go from 4b to chapter 2, verse 4b, and the story goes to the end of chapter 3, but there's no way in the world we're going to talk about all that. It just can't be done. But we'll be asking about, instead of the details of the translation and so on, but rather we're going to be asking what really is the invitation here? And that's different than how most of my Bible studies have gone. This will be different. It'll be fun. Thank you so much for being here. Next week, 10:30 a.m. Pacific or 6:30 p.m. Pacific. God bless you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank